One of the first things people learned about ancient Egypt are the myths. And that's because they're so fascinating, so brilliantly conceived, and so perfectly valid today. Because myth, like cosmology, stands outside of space and time. So myth is as valid now as it was then and as it will be. It's always incredibly valuable. And we can go into such depths with it, because what is myth? Well, myth is a very simple sounding story. It's a story told in very everyday, normal words, normal things happening, more or less. And even if you only understand the very superficial meaning, its inner meanings are reverberating within you. So energetically, you may be getting much more than your mind thought it got. Several of the temples in Egypt developed their own creation myth, and each one is quite different because creation is such a metaphysical, abstract, multidimensional subject that for human mind, you cannot pinpoint it. So each of the temples came up with a different viewpoint of how you might look at this concept of creation, this vital concept. You know, how did we come into being? How did that happen? It happened. We're here. Now, all of the downloads I've received here have been around the creation myth of Iunu, what the Greeks later called Heliopolis. And this incredible myth we'll get to maybe in the next video or soon. We'll go through what that reveals, but it reveals 9 of the most important netters in our life, that is the cosmic laws that we're constantly under their effect, and the 9 numbers of our known numerical system, including, but not mentioning, the 0. Like the fool, it's there, but we usually don't talk about it. Of course, there are many other kinds of myths, not only about creation. And out of all of those, for sure, the one you heard about first was the myth of Osiris. And that is, it's one of the most intimately personal stories that each of us can relate to in our own way. So that myth brilliantly introduces us to 4 characters, 4 netters, and they are, first of all, Osiris, and then Isis, his twin sister, wife, and then Seth, his twin brother, and Nephthys, his twin sister. And these are the 4 netters at the end of the Iunu creation myth that we're going to be looking at in great detail later, especially those last 2, Seth and Nephthys, very, very important for us today. Isis and Osiris also very important, but they work in quite different areas. And all that's covered in the myth. Something the Prophet Muhammad said is that every verse in the Quran has 7 levels of meaning. Now, when I read that, I thought that's probably true of all sacred literature. You see, the outer meaning of myth is available to everyone because it's so clearly written, so perfectly conceived, and so understandable by us humans that, of course, you remember it and you even enjoy it, you love it, because its subtleties, even though you're not picking up on them with your regular senses, They're entering into you, and so you're taking on cosmic information. You're aligning yourself with cosmic law by listening to and learning to understand the netters. These were taught to children. People grew up with the myth of Osiris and Horus and all that stuff. They grew up with it, just as the Sufis here begin their practices very young, often. Like 1.5, 2-year-old, they're already involved. So these traditions had incredibly deep roots that we're not accustomed to in our Western way of moving around the world. Myth, of course, also appeals to the left side of the brain. So to the intuitive, creative, dream side part of us, the childlike part of us. And that's why the stories of the myths can easily be understood by children. And in fact, they appeal to the child within us. That's why we fall in love with them. They're once upon a time. They're outside of time. So just think, if you'd grown up listening to these stories, and they're all about everyday situations and objects around you. Children needed to learn about crocodiles. There were crocodiles in the Nile. This is not science fiction. They were there. So the child had to be warned. And so they grew up with these myths. They learned very practical things about scorpions and the jackal in the desert, many things. I'm sitting out on my terrace tonight. It's a beautiful warm evening. And this is how it would have been in the olden days when the sages were teaching up on the roofs of the temples, watching the stars, because what better place to study astrology and astronomy? These are two of the major subjects for cosmology, to understand man's relation to the world and other planets and stars around himself. And one of the magical things about the ancient teaching is that it was part of the oral tradition. So everything was transmitted through the human voice, and that means sound. The breath of Ra, the air, coming through the vocal cords and creating sounds. And this is manifestation through sound by Ra. And there's a verse in the Quran that says, when Allah wants to bring a thing into being, He just says to it, be, and it is. This is an immediate, instant manifestation. And this is very similar to what we have with the Netta Atum, the number 1 in the Uno-creation myth, who is instant creation through sound. Because the word is something very powerful, and a lot of that knowledge has been lost in our days. We're so visually bombarded with computers and screens. But the word was always the number 1 thing. In the beginning was the word, and the word was God, and the word was be. And the power of the word has never been lost in Egypt. It's still understood and used. Myth is the most ingenious form of preserving and communicating both practical and esoteric ideas, because they're told in such simple everyday language that everyone can speak about them and remember them. If you've ever tried to read technological or scientific manuals, you'll find that they're very hard, and unless you're a specialist in that subject, very difficult to remember. So the myths were made easy for everyone, and therefore they were repeated again and again. They were on everyone's tongue. Stories like that of Isis and Osiris, of a woman losing her husband, is something that everyone can relate to Both men and women can relate to this story. It's very human. And our understanding of the netters comes from the myths, because when the great sages personified the netters, they became the characters who appear in all the stories. All the myths are about the netters personified. So the myths are peopled by these netters, by cosmic laws. So even though you're not aware of that connection, people were speaking about these things all the time, and they were completely in touch with nature. Life was inconceivable without the netters. Everything was done with them, by them, and through them. Effectively, the myths were your guidebook to life. They explained everything you need to know. So tonight was an introduction to myth, something that is very much alive. It's not about people in the past. It's not a historical thing, and it's not about ancient Egypt. The myths are as alive today as they always were and always will be, because they're outside of time. So when you enter into the myth, you become part of the story. You live part of the story, and you embody it. So you have a complete understanding of what is being said. When you enjoyed tonight's video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and should you wish to buy me a coffee, you're most welcome. There'll be a link in the description box below. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next video from Return to Cosmic Law. Thanks for watching.